The morning air at the Richmond shipyard carried the smell of welding flux and fresh paint across the waters of San Francisco Bay. It was late 1943, and Commander Giorgio Giorgis of the Italian Royal Navy stood at the edge of a construction way, watching something that his training told him was impossible. Before him, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel sat nearly complete, its hull plates welded together with a precision that made no sense given the speed of assembly. Beside him, an American naval officer checked his watch and mentioned, almost casually, that this ship had been nothing but a keel laying just 42 days earlier. Giorgis did the calculation in his head twice, certain he had misunderstood the English. In Italy, a vessel one-third this size took a year to build, sometimes longer. This had to be an exceptional case, perhaps a propaganda demonstration arranged specifically for the Italian prisoners of war being shown American industrial facilities. But the American officer was already walking toward the next berth, where another hull was taking shape, and then another beyond that. Giorgis counted 6 vessels under construction simultaneously at this single yard, and his escort mentioned that Richmond had multiple facilities, each operating around the clock. The numbers began to press against everything Giorgis had learned at the Italian Naval Academy in Livorno, where instructors had taught that shipbuilding was fundamentally a craft, an art that required time and the skilled hands of experienced shipwrights. What he was seeing looked less like shipbuilding and more like assembling a giant machine from prefabricated parts. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The path that brought Giorgis to this shipyard had begun in the waters off Sicily in July of 1943, when his destroyer, the Vivaldi, was crippled by British aircraft during the Allied invasion. The crew had abandoned ship, and Giorgis, along with most of his officers, was captured by American forces advancing through southern Italy. By September, when Italy signed the armistice with the Allies, Giorgis and several hundred other Italian naval officers found themselves in a peculiar position. They were no longer enemies, exactly, but not quite allies either. The Americans, recognizing that many Italian officers had professional training and expertise, began selecting certain prisoners for what they called educational visits to American military and industrial facilities. The stated purpose was to demonstrate American capabilities and to prepare Italian officers for potential cooperation in the continuing war against Germany. The unstated purpose, Giorgis suspected, was to ensure that these men understood exactly why continuing to fight had been futile. Giorgis had been skeptical of American claims from the beginning. During his training in the late 1930s, Italian instructors had painted a picture of American industry as vast but inefficient, capable of producing quantity but lacking the precision and quality of European manufacturing. The Americans made automobiles and household appliances, the thinking went, but sophisticated military equipment required the kind of engineering tradition that only European nations possessed. This view had been reinforced by Italian propaganda throughout the war, which had consistently portrayed American industrial production figures as exaggerated or outright fabricated. When Giorgis heard claims that America was building ships by the hundreds, he assumed the reports meant small patrol craft or simple barges, not actual ocean-going cargo vessels. The first crack in this understanding came not at the shipyard, but during the train journey from the POW processing center to San Francisco. The train had traveled for 3 days across the American continent, and Giorgis had spent much of that time staring out the window at the landscape rolling past. The scale of everything had been unsettling. Factories stretched for miles along rivers in Pennsylvania, steel mills in Ohio glowed day and night, and rail yards in Chicago seemed to extend to the horizon. In one switching station, Giorgis had counted over 200 freight cars waiting to be sorted, more rolling stock than he had seen in all of Italy. His fellow officers had noticed the same things, and their conversations had grown quieter as the journey progressed. Lieutenant Paolo Sardi, who had served on cruisers for a decade, had finally spoken what they were all thinking. If this is all real, if this is their normal capacity and not some elaborate show for our benefit, then we never had a chance. At the Richmond shipyard, That assessment was becoming impossible to deny. The American escort, a lieutenant commander named Wilson, who spoke serviceable Italian, was explaining the Liberty ship program with a matter-of-fact tone that made the extraordinary sound routine. The United States Maritime Commission had designed a standardized cargo ship based on a British tramp steamer design, Wilson explained. The ships were not elegant or particularly fast, but they were simple to build and could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo across any ocean. More importantly, they could be built quickly because the entire construction process had been redesigned around mass production principles. Georgis understood mass production in theory. He had read about Henry Ford's automobile assembly lines, where workers performed repetitive tasks as vehicles moved past them. But applying such methods to shipbuilding seemed absurd. Ships were not automobiles. They were complex structures requiring custom fitting and skilled craftsmanship. Each hull was unique, requiring constant adjustment and adaptation during construction. At least, that was how ships had always been built in, every Navy Georgis knew. Wilson led the Italian officers into a massive warehouse adjacent to the construction ways. Inside, the space was organized into distinct zones, each focused on building a specific section of a ship. In one area, workers assembled bulkheads. In another, deck sections took shape. A third zone produced complete bow sections, while a fourth built stern assemblies. Each piece was constructed according to precise specifications, measured and checked against templates to ensure uniformity. Georgis watched as a completed bulkhead section, perhaps 30 feet high and 40 feet wide, was lifted by an overhead crane and moved toward the staging area. The section had been built in days, not weeks, and it would fit into the hull without any custom adjustment, because the hull itself was built to the same exacting specifications. This was the fundamental innovation that Georgis was struggling to grasp. The Americans had not found a way to build ships faster through better craftsmanship or harder work. They had eliminated craftsmanship almost entirely from the basic construction process. Every Liberty ship was identical to every other Liberty ship, built from the same plans with the same materials assembled in the same sequence. Workers did not need years of apprenticeship to master their tasks, because each task was simple and repetitive. A man who welded deck plates together on one ship would weld identical deck plates on the next ship and the next, until he could do it in his sleep. The complexity had been moved from the construction floor to the planning office, where engineers had broken down the entire ship into manageable, standardized components. Sadi was examining a welding operation nearby, where two workers were joining hull plates with electric arc welders. The process was fast, much faster than riveting, and the welds appeared to be holding strong based on the quality inspections Sadi could see being performed. In the Italian Navy, welding was used sparingly, primarily for repairs or in areas where rivets would create water infiltration problems. The traditional method was riveting, which required teams of skilled workers and took considerable time. Each rivet had to be heated, inserted, and hammered into place while still hot, and a single hull might require hundreds of thousands of rivets. Here, the Americans were welding entire seams in the time it would take an Italian crew to place a few dozen rivets. Wilson noticed Sadi's attention and explained that welding had been one of the key technological shifts enabling rapid construction. Welded ships were actually stronger than riveted ones in many ways, because the welds created continuous joints rather than the stress points that rivets introduced. More importantly, welding was faster and required fewer workers. A skilled welder could join plates in hours that would have taken a riveting crew days to complete. The Americans had trained thousands of welders, specifically for shipbuilding, many of them women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war. Wilson pointed toward a nearby team where 2 of the 4 welders were indeed women, working with the same speed and precision as their male colleagues. This detail struck Georgis as particularly significant. In Italy, shipbuilding was a male profession, passed down through generations of workers who had learned their trade over years of apprenticeship. The idea that someone could be trained in a few months to perform skilled shipbuilding work had seemed ludicrous. Yet here it was happening, and happening successfully based on the number of completed ships Georgis could see being fitted out at the far end of the yard. The Americans had not just found faster methods, they had democratized the entire process, making it possible for almost anyone to contribute to ship production after relatively brief training. The tour continued through the afternoon, and with each new area of the shipyard, Georgis felt his understanding of modern warfare shifting. Wilson showed them the testing facilities where welders had to prove their skills before being certified. He explained the inspection regimes that checked every critical weld and structural element. He walked them through the logistics systems that ensured the right materials arrived at the right place at the right time, preventing the delays that had plagued Italian production throughout the war. Everything was organized, systematized, reduced to repeatable processes that could be scaled up or down as needed. Late in the day, Wilson brought the Italian officers to an observation platform overlooking the entire Richmond complex. From this vantage point, the full scope of the operation became visible. 6 ships under construction, another 3 being fitted out with engines and equipment, 2 more having their final systems tested before delivery. Wilson mentioned that Richmond was one of 18 shipyards building Liberty ships across the United States. Some were larger than Richmond, some smaller, but all operated on the same principles of standardization and mass production. The Maritime Commission had originally planned for 2,000 Liberty ships to be built over 4 years. They had exceeded that target in less than 3 years, and were still building more. Georgis did the mathematics in his head. If Richmond could produce approximately 1 ship every 42 days, and there were 18 yards, that meant the United States was launching multiple ships every single day. The numbers seemed too large to be real, but he was standing in the physical evidence of those numbers. Each ship could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. Multiply that capacity by hundreds of ships, then thousands, and you began to understand how the Americans were supplying not just their own forces, but also British, Soviet, and other Allied armies simultaneously across multiple theatres of war. The comparison to Italian capabilities was inescapable. Georgis had served in a navy that considered itself heir to a maritime tradition stretching back to the Roman Empire and the great seafaring republics of Venice and Genoa. Italian shipyards in Genoa, Trieste, and Livorno had built some of the finest warships in the Mediterranean, vessels known for their speed and elegant design. But those same yards had struggled to maintain even modest production rates during the war. The Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa, one of Italy's largest and most advanced facilities, could complete perhaps 4 or 5 destroyers in a good year, and a single cruiser might take 2 years from keel laying to commissioning. The entire Italian merchant marine at the start of the war had totaled roughly 3.5 million tons of shipping. The Americans were replacing that entire capacity every few months with just their Liberty ship program alone, not counting the Victory ships, tankers, and other specialized vessels being built at other facilities. That evening, back at the temporary quarters where the Italian officers were housed, Georgis sat with Sardi and 2 other former commanders, Captain Alessandro Mori and Lieutenant Dino Calvetti, discussing what they had witnessed. Mori, who had commanded the heavy cruiser Trieste before it was sunk in 1943, had spent 15 years in the Italian Navy and considered himself well versed in naval construction. He had been taking notes throughout the tour, filling a small notebook with figures and observations. Now he spread his calculations across the table, and the numbers told a story that was difficult to accept. The Trieste, Mori explained, had been laid down in 1925 and commissioned in 1928, a construction period of roughly 3 years, for a ship that displaced 14,000 tons. The vessel had represented the cutting edge of Italian naval engineering, equipped with 8-inch guns and capable of 35 knots. It had also cost the Italian government approximately 125 million lire to build, an enormous investment that had required authorization at the highest levels of government. By contrast, a Liberty ship cost the Americans roughly $2 million, which at the exchange rates of the time translated to perhaps 40 million lire. The Liberty ship was admittedly simpler, unarmed, and slower than a cruiser, but it could carry cargo that kept armies fighting. And the Americans were building them faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them. Calvetti, who had worked in the Italian Naval Ministry's logistics division before the war, added another dimension to the analysis. He had seen the reports on Italian industrial production and knew the constraints the Italian Navy had operated under. Italy's steel production in 1940 had been approximately 2 million tons per year, a respectable figure for a European nation, but a fraction of what the major powers could achieve. Much of that steel had to be diverted to the Army, the Air Force, and civilian needs. The Navy received perhaps 20%, roughly 400,000 tons annually, and from that allocation had to build and maintain not just new ships, but also repair existing vessels, produce ammunition, and manufacture all the other steel components a modern navy required. The Americans, by contrast, were producing over 80 million tons of steel per year by 1943, and that figure was still increasing. Even if only a small percentage went to shipbuilding, the absolute numbers dwarfed Italian capacity. Wilson had mentioned that a single Liberty ship required roughly 7,000 tons of steel. At Richmond alone, the yard was using more steel for shipbuilding every month than Italy's entire annual naval allocation. Multiply that across all 18 Liberty shipyards, then add the other shipbuilding programs for warships, tankers, and specialized vessels, and the disparity became almost incomprehensible. Sardi raised the question that had been troubling all of them since the morning. Why had Italian intelligence failed so completely to understand American industrial capacity? It was not as if this capability had appeared overnight. The Americans had been building their industrial base for decades, and much of it was visible to anyone who cared to look. The automobile factories, the steel mills, the electrical generating capacity, all of it had been documented in trade publications and economic reports before the war. Yet somehow, Italian military planners had convinced themselves that this industrial might was either exaggerated or irrelevant to modern warfare. Giorgis thought he understood part of the answer. There had been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of war was being fought. Italian naval doctrine, like that of most European navies, had focused on decisive fleet engagements, where superior tactics and ship design would determine victory. The idea was that a smaller but more professional and better trained navy could defeat a larger but less skilled opponent through maneuver and gunnery. That doctrine had some historical basis. The Japanese had defeated Russia in 1905, despite having fewer ships, and the British Royal Navy had maintained dominance for centuries, partly through superior seamanship and training. But that kind of warfare assumed relatively equal industrial bases and conflicts of limited duration. World War II had proven to be something entirely different. It was a war of production, of logistics, of industrial systems grinding against each other until one side simply ran out of material. Individual ship quality mattered less than the total tonnage that could be put to sea. Crew training mattered less than the ability to replace losses. In such a conflict, the side that could build ships faster than they could be sunk would eventually overwhelm any opponent, regardless of tactical skill or technological sophistication. The Americans had understood this intuitively, perhaps because their entire national culture was built around mass production and industrial efficiency. They had applied those same principles to warfare and created a military-industrial system that could simply outproduce the Axis powers combined. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Giorgis had joined the Italian Navy, believing he was serving in a force that could project Italian power across the Mediterranean and challenge British dominance in that sea. The Navy's motto, In Mare Libertas, reflected a proud tradition and a sense of professional competence. Officers like Giorgis had trained rigorously, studied naval history and tactics, and believed that their skill and dedication could make the difference in combat. But what did skill matter when the enemy could replace every ship you sank twice over, could resupply armies across oceans with a merchant fleet larger than your entire navy, could afford to lose vessels to submarines and simply build more? Over the following weeks, the Italian officers were taken to other facilities. They visited Kaiser's shipyard in Portland, Oregon, where the production methods were even more refined than at Richmond. They toured steel mills in Pennsylvania, where furnaces ran continuously, producing more steel in a day than some Italian facilities managed in a month. They saw aircraft factories where bombers rolled off assembly lines at a rate of several per day. Each visit reinforced the same lesson. The war had never been even remotely close in terms of industrial capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At the Portland Yard, Georgis witnessed something that epitomized the entire American approach to wartime production. The yard manager, a civilian named Edgar, was giving them a tour of the facility when an alarm sounded. Workers immediately stopped what they were doing and moved to designated assembly points. Georgis thought perhaps there was an emergency, but Edgar explained that this was a drill they conducted regularly. The shipyard practiced emergency procedures to ensure that if there was ever a fire, accident, or other crisis, every worker knew exactly what to do. More importantly, Edgar explained, they timed these drills and used the data to optimize their processes. If workers were taking too long to reach safety points, they redesigned the paths. If equipment was in the way, they moved it. Everything was measured, analyzed, and improved. This obsession with efficiency and optimization extended to every aspect of the operation. Edgar showed them charts tracking production times for each stage of ship construction. He pointed out bottlenecks where one process was slower than others and explained how they were working to eliminate those delays. He discussed worker fatigue studies that had led to adjusted shift schedules. He mentioned the cafeteria layout, which had been designed to minimize the time workers spent in line so they could maximize their rest period during breaks. It was this kind of systematic thinking, applied to every detail, that enabled the extraordinary production rates. The Liberty ships themselves, Georgis learned, were designed with the same philosophy. They were not beautiful ships. They had a blunt, utilitarian appearance that no European naval architect would have considered acceptable for a vessel carrying their nation's flag. The Italian merchant marine had prided itself on elegant liners and well-proportioned cargo ships, but the Liberty ships were designed purely for function. They had a simple reciprocal steam engine rather than more efficient turbines, because reciprocal engines were easier to manufacture and maintain. They used older, proven technology throughout rather than cutting-edge systems, because older technology meant fewer production delays and simpler training for crews. They even had a standardized layout so that any crew member trained on one Liberty ship could serve on any other without retraining. This pragmatism was foreign to Georgis's training. Italian engineers took pride in innovation, in pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Italian warships incorporated the latest fire control systems, the most powerful engines for their size, the most advanced armor schemes. But those advanced systems took time to develop, were expensive to produce, and often suffered reliability problems in service. The Americans had chosen a different path. Accept good enough technology, standardize it completely, and build it in enormous quantities. A Liberty ship might not be as fast or efficient as a custom-designed freighter, but it could be built in 6 weeks and would reliably carry cargo across any ocean. When you could build them that quickly, it did not matter if some were lost to U-boats or storms, you simply built more. Mori, during one of their evening discussions, compared it to the difference between a craftsman making custom shoes and a factory producing thousands of identical pairs. The custom shoes might fit better and last longer, but the factory could outfit an entire army in the time it took the craftsman to make a few dozen pairs. In warfare, especially modern industrialized warfare, quantity had become its own quality. An adequate ship available now was worth more than a perfect ship available next year. The officers also learned about the human systems supporting this production. The Americans had mobilized their entire society for war production in a way that Italy never had. Women worked in shipyards, aircraft factories, and ammunition plants. Workers who had been farmers or shopkeepers received training and became welders or riveters. The government had coordinated with industry to ensure efficient allocation of resources, preventing the competition and hoarding that had plagued Italian war production. Labor unions had agreed to no-strike pledges for the duration of the war. Universities conducted research to improve production methods. It was a total national effort, and the results were visible in facilities like Richmond and Portland. One detail that stuck with Georgis was the story of the SS Robert E. Peary, which Wilson had mentioned during the Richmond tour. In November of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond Yard had set out to demonstrate how quickly a Liberty ship could be built if all delays were eliminated and all systems worked perfectly. The keel was laid on a Sunday morning, and by the following Thursday afternoon, just 4 days and 15.5 hours later, the completed ship was launched. It was a publicity stunt, designed to boost morale and demonstrate American capability, but it was not a fake. The ship was fully functional and went on to serve throughout the war. Georgis had initially dismissed this as propaganda, but Edgar confirmed it and explained that while such speed was exceptional, the normal production time of 42 days was achieved consistently across all the yards. 42 days. The phrase kept echoing in Georgis's mind. In 42 days, an American shipyard could build a 10,000-ton cargo vessel from raw steel to finished ship. In that same period, an Italian yard might complete the hull plating on a destroyer if everything went smoothly. The implications were staggering. It meant that the longer the war continued, the more hopeless the Axis position became. Every month, the Allies were adding more shipping capacity than they lost. Every month, the industrial disparity grew larger. Victory had not been impossible because of some tactical failure or strategic blunder. Victory had been mathematically impossible from the moment the United States entered the war. The Italian officers were not the only ones being educated about American industrial power. The program that brought them to these facilities also included German prisoners of war, Japanese officers captured in the Pacific, and even some personnel from Vichy French forces. The Americans seemed determined to ensure that anyone who might have doubted their capabilities understood the reality. In some cases, this knowledge would be useful when these men returned to their countries after the war and could provide accurate assessments of what they had witnessed. In other cases, it served a more immediate psychological purpose, breaking the will to resist by demonstrating that resistance was futile. For Georgis, the experience was humbling in a way that combat had never been. When the Vivaldi had been sunk, he had felt the normal emotions of defeat, frustration, anger at circumstances, determination to fight again if given the chance. But there had been no shame in losing a battle. Ships sank. That was the nature of naval warfare. What he felt now was different. It was the realization that he and his fellow officers had spent years training for a war they could never have won, serving a regime that had led their nation into a conflict without understanding what victory would require. They had been professionals taking pride in their professionalism, never grasping that professionalism alone meant nothing against an enemy who could outbuild, outproduce, and outlast you through sheer industrial might. By early 1944, as Allied forces pushed up the Italian peninsula and the war in Europe entered what would be its final phase, Georgis and many other Italian officers were released from prisoner status. The new Italian government, having switched sides to join the Allies against Germany, needed experienced naval personnel. Some officers chose to return to service, operating smaller vessels in support of Allied operations. Others, like Georgis, had lost their appetite for warfare after what they had witnessed in America. He accepted a position with the Italian Naval Ministry in Rome, where he worked on logistics and planning for the post-war reconstruction of Italy's merchant marine. In that role, Georgis found himself dealing with an ironic situation. Italy needed cargo ships desperately to rebuild its shattered economy, but Italian shipyards had been damaged by bombing and lacked the resources to resume production quickly. The solution came in the form of Liberty ships. The United States, which had built far more cargo vessels than it needed, began selling or leasing them to Allied nations. Italy received dozens of Liberty ships in the years immediately after the war. Vessels that became the foundation of the rebuilt Italian merchant fleet. Georgis helped arrange the transfer of these ships and the training of Italian crews to operate them. It was a strange experience, working with the very same type of vessel whose construction had so thoroughly shattered his understanding of warfare and industry. The broader lesson of the Liberty Ship program extended far beyond maritime history. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought in the industrial age. The Second World War was the first truly global conflict where industrial production capacity was the decisive factor in determining victory. Previous wars had certainly involved industrial elements, but never on such a scale, or with such direct correlation between production and outcome. The Liberty ships were the clearest symbol of this new reality. They were not particularly good ships by traditional standards. They were slow, uncomfortable, and prone to cracking in cold water. But they were adequate for their purpose, and they existed in such numbers that their individual weaknesses did not matter. American industrial production during World War II reached levels that would have seemed impossible before the conflict. The Liberty ship program alone, producing 2,710 vessels between 1941 and 1945, represented roughly 30 million tons of shipping. That was nearly 10 times Italy's entire pre-war merchant fleet, built in just 4 years. And the Liberty ships were only one element of a vast production apparatus that included tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of ammunition, and all the other materiel required to fight a global war on multiple fronts simultaneously. For the Italian officers who witnessed this production firsthand, it answered many questions that had troubled them during the war. They had wondered how American forces seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything, while Axis forces scrounged for fuel and ammunition. They had puzzled over how the Allies could lose hundreds of ships to U-boats, yet still maintain their supply lines. They had struggled to understand how American units could be so wasteful with resources, expending ammunition freely, and abandoning damaged equipment rather than repairing it. The answer was simple. America could afford to be wasteful because they produced far more than they needed. An army that never worried about ammunition supply could fight more aggressively. A navy that could replace lost ships in weeks rather than years could take greater risks. Logistics became a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. The Liberty ship program also demonstrated something about American culture that Europeans had often misunderstood. Americans were not, as Axis propaganda had claimed, soft or decadent or incapable of sacrifice. They had simply organized their society around different principles. Where European nations emphasized tradition, craftsmanship, and hierarchy, American culture valued innovation, efficiency, and pragmatic problem-solving. Those values translated directly into industrial practices. An American engineer did not care if a ship was beautiful. He cared if it worked and if it could be built quickly. An American factory manager did not insist on doing things the way they had always been done. He constantly looked for improvements. An American worker did not need years of apprenticeship if the job could be simplified enough to be learned in weeks. In the decades after the war, Georgis occasionally returned to the subject of the Liberty ships in conversations with younger Italian naval officers. He wanted them to understand that modern warfare was about more than tactics or courage. It was about industrial systems, logistical networks, and the ability to sustain military operations over time. The most brilliant admiral commanding the finest warships ever built could not defeat an enemy who could simply outlast him through superior production. The lesson was particularly relevant during the Cold War, when the military balance between the Soviet Union and the West was again being calculated in terms of production capacity and industrial strength. One of the Liberty ships, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, was preserved as a museum ship in San Francisco, not far from where Georgis had first witnessed their construction. The vessel served as a reminder of an era when American industrial might had been mobilized for total war. Visitors could walk the decks, examine the engine room, and try to imagine what it had been like when hundreds of such ships crowded harbors and crossed oceans, loaded with the supplies that sustained Allied armies. For those who knew the history, the ship also represented a lesson about the dangers of underestimating an opponent's capabilities and the importance of understanding the economic and industrial foundations of military power. Georgis lived until 1978, long enough to see Italy rebuild from the devastation of war and establish itself as a prosperous member of the European community. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, but in a few recorded interviews conducted in the 1970s, He reflected on what the Liberty ships had meant to him personally. They had represented, he said, the moment when he understood that the war had never been a contest between equals. Italy had entered the conflict believing in the superiority of its military traditions and the skill of its armed forces. But traditions and skill meant nothing against an enemy who could build faster, produce more, and sustain operations indefinitely. The Liberty ships had been adequate vessels built in extraordinary numbers, and in modern warfare, that was what mattered most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.